While people are filtering in, I just want to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We have a few hundred people registered, and people I'm just seeing are coming into the room now. So we're just going to give it a minute before we begin, but we do want to start as soon as possible because we have a lot to get through today. Welcome, everyone. For those who are just joining, we're really pleased to have you here today. This webinar is going to be in English and French. In English with French interpretation. If you need, you can access the interpreter in your controls at the bottom of the screen. And the session is also being recorded so that we can share on our website and YouTube channels with members and partners who couldn't make it today. Your faces, of course, because it's a webinar, aren't seen, but just remember that anything in the chat may be visible. And if you feel comfortable, please introduce yourself in the chat so that everyone here can get a sense of who's in the room. My name is Sarah Kernitsky. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at Philanthropic Foundations Canada. I am a settler on this land. I'm the granddaughter of refugees from Latvia, from Hungary, and Ukraine. My grandparents came to Canada several decades ago, fleeing violence and oppression. So that's my background. But I do feel it is important to continually recognize the many territories of Turtle Island on which we all live and acknowledge the continuing Indigenous presence and land rights. While I live in Toronto, the traditional territory of many communities and nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, I'm actually speaking to you today from Montreal. Montreal is a traditional territory which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange for many Indigenous communities, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. Montreal is now home to many diverse communities, Inuit and Métis people. As a settler, I do make it my professional and personal responsibilities to continually learn and understand the history and legacy of colonialism, and know that reconciliation requires action. So I do strive to ensure in my personal work and in my work at PFC that we move together towards a much more just future. This webinar today was developed in partnership with PFC and Imagine Canada. If you're not familiar, PFC is Canada's national network, a network for philanthropists and grant makers. We're a registered charitable organization strengthening philanthropy in all of its diversity in partnership for a just, equitable, and sustainable world. We work in collaboration with civil society, private sector, and governments. And for more than 20 years, we've been bringing together grant makers and foundations and others to connect, learn, and advance the best solutions for change on the issues that matter most. Imagine Canada is a national network of organizations and individuals that advocate for and invest in the future of the nonprofit and charitable sector. Through research, network building, convening, public policy development, government relations, and capacity and funding support, Imagine seeks to champion the hard work being done by organizations and communities every day. So we wanted to offer this webinar because Bill 216 is a very important issue, which if passed will have ramifications for our sector. And so we're bringing a range of leaders here to engage with you today about the bill, as well as the issues that it seeks to address, what it might mean for our work in the nonprofit and charitable sector. So now I'm going to pass it over to our moderator for the webinar, Susan Manwaring, who will introduce herself and explain a bit more about the format today and moderate the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to moderate this session. I am, as Sarah said, Susan Manwaring, and I'm the lead of the Charities and Not-for-Profit or Social Impact Group at Miller Thomson. We are a national law firm and we work with organizations across the country. And today's session is going to be both an explanation of Bill S-216 and overview by the person who really drove the initiative to get Bill S-216 started and introduced in the Senate, Senator Ratna Omidvar. And then we're going to hear from Philip Lawrence, who's the MP for Northumberland, Peterborough South. And Philip has been the sponsor in Parliament of the bill, and it had first reading in February, a few weeks ago, in the House of Commons, and we're hoping that it will continue forward. There's a big agenda in the House, but we want to see this move forward as the work gets done. And after we hear from Senator Omidyar and MP Lawrence, we're going to hear from two organizations who work with many organizations that would fit into perhaps the grassroots category. And they're going to share their experience with working with organizations today, with sort of under the existing rules, how things happen. And then I'm also going to ask them some comments and input on how things might change if we're successful in moving forward with Bill S-216. And then we would love to take some questions. So we're hoping we have time at the end to take some questions from you. Before we start, there was a couple of things I wanted to say just about from a more technical aspect. One is, just to ensure everybody's on the same page, what we're talking about here is how registered charities can work with non-charities. And the technical term that the Income Tax Act uses is non-qualified donee. So when we talk about that issue, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the work that charities do with non-Canadian charities. And I should be specific about that because many international organizations work with Canadian charities, and they're charities in their own country, but they don't fit into the qualified donee category in Canada because they're not established here. But there's also many domestic organizations that are working in Canada that haven't registered as a charity, and they would also fit into that category. And currently what we see is that the Income Tax Act says that a charity can only operate either by making grants of its money or resources to another qualified donee, to another Canadian registered charity, or by carrying on its own activities. And those current rules are what is causing the current frustration, because many organizations that haven't registered as a charity in Canada are doing work that furthers charitable purposes, but it's not work that we can grant to because they're a separate legal entity. So today, in order to work with those types of organizations, and many registered charities find a way to do it, we end up, lawyers like me, end up putting in place agreements and contracts that tend to be quite burdensome, require oversight and direction that is sometimes unpalatable to the party that we're working with. And it's those rules that we really want to move away from. We feel that the current rules lead us to a place where there's some almost fiction created in the type of relationship we have with the non-charity. And the bill that has been introduced, we think will move away from that and make everything more transparent and accountable. So, but you're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear from the speakers and the panelists today. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists in quick order to introduce themselves. And I'll start with Senator Omidyar and work through, and then we'll turn to the discussion. Senator.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you so much to PFC for convening this important discussion. And I'm really pleased that Susan has set the stage and has deconstructed the technical aspects of the bill, because now I can focus on, in my few minutes, on how the bill as it is currently written impacts vulnerable communities, which then will lead me to why we need to change it and what the proposal is. So as Susan said,
Senator Omidyar, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. We're going to let the other panelists introduce themselves, and then I'm going to come back to you. So over to Philip Lawrence, please.
Good afternoon, I guess, everyone. Philip Lawrence, Member of Parliament from Northumberland, Peterborough South. I also have the privilege of being the Shadow Minister for Economic Development for Eastern, Central, and Southern Ontario. I was formerly the Shadow Minister for the Canada Revenue Agency. And so that's how I originally became involved in this legislation. So very excited to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate.
Okay, and Jacqueline, I'm going to turn to you next.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me and for for convening this conversation. So my name is Jacqueline Lee Tam. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from Tiohtià:ke, or what is known as Montreal, on the lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, who are the keepers of the Eastern Door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I'm the co-director of the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, and we're a support structure for grassroots climate justice organizers and activists, also known as non-qualified donees in the language of the Income Tax Act. So I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about this with you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And finally, over to you, Bill.
Tansei, I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga, the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples in Toronto. And my name is Bill Mintram. I work as Director of Indigenous and Northern Relations with the Rideau Hall Foundation. And I'm Métis, and also have some of the background in terms of being an executive director of a friendship center and experience working within that realm. Thank you.
Thank you. And now back to Senator Omidvar.
I apologize, Susan. Sorry
No,
about that.
don't worry.
I
It's
just
okay.
sort of,
You're
okay.
very enthusiastic about it.
Well, and we
As
have
we
lots to talk about, so I'll be brief, since Susan already provided the context of and the impact of the bill. So I'll focus my time on why I am so motivated to change the Income Tax Act. Never in my life did I ever think that as a senator I would approach the Income Tax Act, but in truth, most of the legislation that applies to charities is embedded in the Income Tax Act, and that is the act from which all the current constraints and opportunities for the charitable sector are embedded. So as Susan said, the two words, own activities, which are right in the legislation, which dictate that charities, including private foundations, can give money to other charities or conduct their own charitable activities, is limiting in one way. There is, of course, a workaround, which Susan, and I will use her words, describes as a bit of a legal function. I will focus my remarks on the impact of the legislation as it is currently written on vulnerable communities. So let's start with Indigenous organizations or change makers who are not charities, or they're not a band council or a form of local government, in which case they have a special status. But if they are not a charity working on the ground in a community, the only way they can receive charitable dollars from a foundation or from another charity is to consent to a very complicated and expensive agency or intermediary agreement under which the funding charity, and this is the law, the funding charity, imagine a foundation, must effectively exercise operational control over the activities of the Indigenous organization that they are funding. So I need not tell you how those two words, direction and control, which are the language written in the guidance of the CRA, how those two words are heard by Indigenous communities and organizations. But there are really significant impacts as well. Any intellectual property which is the result of such an agreement, which flows charitable dollars to a non-charitable Indigenous organization, is owned not by the Indigenous organization, but by the charity. All public statements, including public press releases, need approval from the funding charity. The detail to budgets, every line item, approval and reapproval, on-site inspections, minutes of meetings, written records of decisions, and so on and so forth. Every legally binding document must be signed by the charity, including leases. At times, the Indigenous organization may be even required to change their staff if the charity so wishes. This, I know that there are arrangements that are promoted as partnerships, but under the current law, this is not a real partnership at all. And so it is not a wonder then that many foundations, since I'm speaking to PFC, I'm going to use foundations. It is not a wonder then that many foundations shy away from funding Indigenous organizations because A, the complexity of the issues and the rules, and B, not wanting to offend Indigenous peoples. And the results speak for themselves. Less than 0.5% of all charitable dollars flow to Indigenous causes and issues in Canada. The same is true for for organizations who are engaged on racialized groups, providing services to racialized groups or social justice causes. The same context prevails here as well. So money, charitable funding can find its way to non-charitable BIPOC organizations, but it is not a partnership. In my second reading speech in the Senate, I described this as a bit of a takeover as opposed to a partnership. Let me move to...
Go ahead.
I want to quickly move to the impact on overseas organizations, because Canada has a huge international development community, and there is absolutely no way that Canadian charities can exercise direction and control over a local group functioning miles away. They need to rely on those groups in order to further their charitable purpose. So changes to the income tax law that I have proposed in S-216 will close this dissonance between the charitable sector, the philanthropic sector, and Indigenous organizations, BIPOC organizations, and overseas development organizations. And we will do this not by sacrificing accountability in any way, but by getting accountability in a different way. So accountability is paramount. We must provide accountability for charitable dollars, but we can get at accountability a different way. And to that end, I have proposed that the Income Tax Act be amended by removing the two words own activity and replacing them with expenditure responsibility, which technically means the charity has to do a whole lot of due diligence upfront, There likely will be written agreements, but after the agreement is signed, there will be financial control, but no longer operational control of the non-charity. I'm going to stop here because I think Susan wants my time to be over, and happy to take any questions.
Never want your time to be over, but I do want to move to MP Lawrence to ask him, why was he interested? And you mentioned that you were the shadow minister for the national revenue, but it's great, of great interest, I think, to many people on the seminar as to why you were so interested and why you were prepared to take the bill forward and introduce it into the House. I think that would be really helpful.
Thank you very much. And so the reason I became interested is, one, because Senator Omnivar is a force, and I don't know how anyone would ever win an argument against her. So, but I think no, and I mean that only joking. Of course, I've been greatly in debt to the work that Senator Omnivar is doing, and I'm very thankful. But when I go out into my riding, or I've also had the benefit of serving on numerous boards of charitable organizations, I'm struck by a couple things. One, by how many people want to contribute back to our society. How many people from different walks of life, from different backgrounds, they desperately want to contribute back to the community. However, they often face barriers to do so, and unfortunately, that can be government and sometimes, right? So we all know about the bureaucracy that exists around charitable law. Many of the charitable pieces of legislation date back literally in their origin hundreds of years, and we need desperately to modernize and update government to facilitate. We should make it as easy as possible for an individual who gets an idea that they want to help to actualizing that, to making that charity, that dream become a reality. And I saw direction and control as being a major impediment to making that happen. People who wanted to do good, charitable organizations here in Canada who wanted to contribute around the world or wanted to work with other organizations were impeded by a barrier that was so high and so difficult to come by that in order to compensate around it, we had to create these legal fictions that were talked about. So I saw this as a great opportunity to be to join Sen Amy Klobuchar and being a force for good in the world and being able to change the world by making it easier and simpler for charities around the world. And I should be clear, though, that even though this will simplify, that charities will have to account for their resources through through the account resourceability. So they need to be transparent, and so we won't lose. And in fact, I think we'll gain when it comes to accountability and transparency by passing this legislation through. We just will remove the micromanagement operation to that. So I'm very thankful to be part of this, and I'll end by just giving you an update as to where we are in the House, and that is that we have had first reading, and the legislation was basically read into the House, and we are scheduled for May 13th for the first hour of the second reading of the debate, and I look forward to rising. And of course, you might have seen some news about some new partnerships in our Parliament, and so we'll see how this affects it. But I remain confident that our friends in the Parliament will pass this legislation and do what's right for Canadians.
Thank you very much. Senator, did you want to add anything as to the status of the bill at this point?
I will be in the House in the galleys on May the 13th.
That is excellent. That's the first time I've heard about the May 13th date. So we can all put it on our calendars. So I think it's really interesting to hear from you both, and Senator, to hear how you've been talking and explaining the bill. And I think it's very helpful to hear that. I think it's important to emphasize that the intent of the legislation is not to change the reality that registered charities have to do things that further their charitable purposes. That is not at all an objective that's trying to be obtained here. We're in fact reinforcing that with the legislation. In fact, reinforces that with the accountability provisions that are contained. But they do, it is intended to remove that own activities language which Senator Amy Klobuchar referenced, because it really has led to the development of these direction and control requirements. Those words aren't even in the Income Tax Act, but they've been over time used by the Canada Revenue Agency in its guidance for organizations who are working with non-charities as a way to look for the accountability. That type of accountability isn't necessary in other jurisdictions. And it's something that we've often asked the question here, do we really need that in Canada? And what we do have in the context of the draft legislation, and if it goes forward, is the concept that the charity has to ensure that the assets are being used to further their purpose. And that's where the transparency and accountability will come in. And we're hoping, or we think, that those rules will actually, as I think MP Lawrence said and Senator Amy Klobuchar said, actually improve the nature of the relationships, because the relationships will be transparent and they'll be accountable, they'll be clear. We won't be creating contracts of service or agency relationships which may or may not actually be legally accurate. They may be a bit of a legal fiction to achieve the objective of doing the work in furtherance of the charitable purposes. So we're thinking that this change will be an improvement to the Income Tax Act and the provisions that relate to this. So at this point, I think we'd like to go on to the panel discussion to actually hear from Bill and Jacqueline, just to sort of put into context what it's like today, what you find in your day-to-day work when you're working with organizations, some of which may be charities, but some of which may not be charities or qualified donees. So let me start with Bill this time around. Bill, could you tell me more about the work and your working relationship with charities or nonprofits or non-qualified donees, and how that work is going at this point?
Yeah, no, with pleasure. And historically, I had for 2 terms represented the National Association of Friendship Centers and the executive of the board. And within the Friendship Center movement, there are many non-qualified donees who are friendship centers, who've been longstanding organizations. And so that's one aspect of work that I've done with non-qualified donees. However, professionally, within my role as Director of Indigenous and Northern Relations, I also have the opportunity to be able to support non-qualified donees through a funder relationship. And in specific, one that I've been working with just over this last number of months is with a Northern Sustainability stream of funds in support of the Arctic Inspiration Prize laureates. And of those laureates, there are a number that are qualified donees. There are some who are pursuing qualified donee status, but there are many who are non-qualified donees. And I have the opportunity of being able to support the work they're doing, but going through many complex challenges to be able to effectively provide that support in a meaningful way. And I can speak more to that with your further questions.
Okay, and Jacqueline, maybe let's start with you talking about the type of work you do and the working relationships you have, and then we can jump into the other questions.
Sure thing, thank you. So the Climate Justice Organizing Hub is a support structure for grassroots climate justice activists, as I said in my introduction. And so these activists and organizers that we're supporting are non-qualified donees. They are the people who are behind the big climate strikes that you see in the streets, the people who organize actions and protests advocating for real climate action and real climate justice. And these folks are largely unsupported. And it's kind of in that landscape that the Climate Justice Organizing Hub emerged as a way to support this very powerful sector that's mostly youth-led, quite decentralized, grassroots sector that is really pushing the dial on climate action. And our organization was built in line with current charity law, which we do see as restrictive and outdated. But in dancing around these laws, our solution to support non-qualified donees has come through the charitable objective of transmitting knowledge. So skilling up activists and organizers to be able to do their work as opposed to regranting. So that's the nature of our relationship with these non-qualified donees. So we provide workshops and coaching and learning circles and all sorts of knowledge transfer and skilling up activities.
So that's great. So why would you think that increasing access to charitable dollars is so important for those organizations or the organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, for one, it would make our work a lot less burdensome. It means that we would be able to financially support non-qualified donees without jumping through all of the hoops and perhaps, the words direction and control definitely don't land well when you're trying to build relationships with people on the ground, on the front lines, doing difficult work. And yeah, all of the administrative burden would be lifted of navigating those relationships. And then in terms of how it would concretely transform the work of activists, I mean, it would give them a lot more agency to be able to make decisions around their organizing. And we know that grassroots activists are such a powerful group of people. And so increasing that access to charitable dollars would most definitely be beneficial for climate justice activists as well as activists across the board.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And Bill, why do you think it's so important that to see this change? Can you describe for us what you think the difference would be?
Yes, and as Senator Almodovar had mentioned earlier, only 0.5% of philanthropic dollars are being invested in Indigenous-based initiatives. That in itself really speaks to a huge gap that exists between the philanthropic sector and many Indigenous organizations doing absolutely amazing work that are grassroots, some of them existing for long periods of time, and they haven't had the same access to investment. They haven't been able to really walk with Canadians in a strong reconciliation-based relationship where that investment is allowed to flow in an equal manner. And so I really believe it is important that we look at how those accountabilities can be truly representative and overcome some of the barriers that in fact go against the right to self-determination for Indigenous peoples and communities. And so this is a factor that this bill is proposing to provide a solution to how we can overcome some of those areas and really move forward in a good way.
And is there, I'm going to ask a question that's a little bit different than, is just to follow up on that. Like, why is it so difficult to work within the current system? Like, what is it like from a barrier or perspective of some of the organizations you're working with? If some people say, well, why do we have to change? Why can't we just leave it the way it is? Can you maybe share your perspective on that question for the audience?
Yeah, many organizations, they've been doing work for a good amount of time, or they're starting new initiatives and they're working within the systems that they know. They're stretched to the maximum often with very limited funds, but they're working with funders who do provide monies outside of the charitable sector, such as provincial or territorial governments and other funding entities. And those organizations that are on the ground doing the work, they don't necessarily have, they're not aware of what opportunities exist within the philanthropic world. And the farther you get from the philanthropic hubs where the organizations exist, the likelihood of becoming a charity is probably reduced as well, such as in Canada's north, that across the Arctic, there are very few charities. And within the organizations that are doing the work, they often look at what's required to become a charity, what their similar organizations are doing, and many of them who have not become charities. And so it isn't seen as something that's going to necessarily benefit them or that they can achieve within a reasonable period of time. And so it's not done. However, not realizing the disconnect that it creates and the barriers that it creates as a result, as well on the self-determination side, that organizations feel that they're then under a stricter or stronger means of controls that tell them how they should be doing their work instead of allowing them to define their own institutions. And so some of those elements also add to that.
And Jacqueline, similarly, I mean, how would you describe the difference and why is it? I mean, there are many today who might say, well, why can't those organizations become charities, or why can't they work? And it'd be interesting just to get your perspective and sort of about the barriers or how they're working and why, why we need to do this in your view.
Yeah, and similar to Bill, what Bill said about, the farther away you get from the philanthropic world, the less likely you are to have ties to be able to access it or desire to access it, right? So thinking about distance, perhaps philosophically or culturally, grassroots climate justice activists do not want to be charities. There is, a strong resistance against the institutionalization of grassroots work by nature of it being grassroots and citizen-led and community-driven. So whenever any kind of institutional or funded structure enters the grassroots space, the space is fraught and trust needs to be built. And so I can say with most certainty that the language of direction and control and the need for jumping through many hoops to get money to the grassroots level is not a good foot to start off a relationship on. So if charities are needing to work with the grassroots sector to further their charitable objectives, relationships is such an important piece. And so you want to be making the conditions good for those relationships to be built in a good way. So yeah, I think I might leave it there on that question, if that answers it for you.
And you've heard us talk about the fact that the bill that's proposed is going to still require accountability. And so what's your reaction to that I just want to get at, this isn't about it's not about removing accountability. It's still got to be furthering the purposes. But in your mind, that still is helpful to accessing more charitable dollars or more dollars in furtherance of the objectives. Can you just speak to that for a few minutes?
For sure, yeah. I think accountability can look in many different ways, and definitely should not look like direction and control or a takeover of other people's activities. I'm a firm believer that the people who are at the center of struggles for justice have the most expertise and the most know-how of how to go about their issue. And accountability, I think, in the context of community and relationships, is always so much stronger than audits or reports, all of these fictions that can be created. And there are so many ways to imagine what that could look like. I think having trust as a basis there opens the door for so many more relationships of accountability, be it in closer partnerships where meetings and updates happen in a more casual way, or where there's open lines of communication between the charity and the non-qualified donee. And I think one thing that Chris Archie from the Circle said at a different gathering is that there's a lot of anxiety perhaps in the philanthropic world about accountability, and I think this is explored a lot when people think about trust-based philanthropy, and a similar parallel can be drawn here between charities and non-qualified donees about trust there. But accountability in community is so strong. If people are spending money in bad ways, their community members are gonna be keeping them in check. So I think that's also something to consider, that perhaps there is an exaggerated fear around what would happen if this law was changed.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And Bill, similarly to you, maybe some of your thoughts on sort of how it will work and how the accountability, which is so critical. When nobody, as Senator Omid said, no one is saying that there won't be accountability. How do you see it working and helping and improving the access to resources, but also ensuring that they're using the funds to further purposes?
Definitely. I really think there's a huge shift in what's being said between what the current modality is and what this bill is presenting. And as a funder, one of the dynamics and discussions that I have to be able to integrate when I'm working with a non-qualified donee is to essentially say, I know that you're doing amazing work, that the beneficiaries that are being supported by the work that you're doing really believe in you and trust in you. And I need you to see and acknowledge that we believe in you and we trust in you, but we can't actually put that into our agreement with you. That we have to create an agreement that's going to tell you that the work that you're doing is the work of the funder, not the work of the organization, not to the mission of the organization, but rather to my organization. And that we have control over what you're doing and how you're going to do it. And that's a tough conversation for a funder to have with an organization who's doing really good work. And part of what this bill puts forward is a switching of that conversation, that instead of saying, yes, we trust you, but we can't actually document that trust, you can instead say, we trust you and we're going to build the means of how we are able to walk out that accountability and do it in a way that's much more transparent, that's much more relationship driven, instead of imposing something and maintaining the direction and control over it. And so I do think that what's being put forward is a much better resolution to how we can fund in a good way.
And I know that much of the conversation around in the philanthropic sector today, and about very many aspects of the philanthropic sector, not only this issue, is about, and it's in society generally, is about inequality, is about the ability of organizations to be working with each other on level playing fields. And I know we've talked about that a little bit as well, obviously, and it's in your comments and in the comments you both made, but maybe just reflect on how important this might be to changing that perspective in some ways. Maybe Bill, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Jacqueline.
Well, I do believe that as all organizations, as we seek to respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the principles of reconciliation, the acknowledgement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that these types of elements that have been put forward to challenge us as organizations, as communities, as governments, as the many layers serving community, that also has the ability to be walked out in a good way as a result of the change of this legislation, where it can be mutually agreements where there is greater equity in how that relationship, that funding relationship resulting in the beneficiary or relationship to serve communities and individuals, that this assists in our ability to move forward in that direction.
Okay, well, and Jacqueline, maybe your comments on that thought too.
Sure, yeah, and just building on Bill's points as well, and a statistic that I believe Senator Omidvar shared at the very beginning. I believe it's less than 1% of charitable dollars in Canada flow to Indigenous communities, and that's quite frankly unacceptable. And I think any ways where we can break down the barriers to accessing charitable dollars is going to increase equity. And it's quite as simple as that. I am of the belief that charitable laws are outdated and restrict a lot of the good work that people are doing for social change. And all of the laws, well, just the number of laws and the extent, the details of them they pose very high barriers to people who want to access this money. They gatekeep money, which is gatekeeping hegemony. And so if we want to be increasing the flow of charitable dollars in a more redistributive manner, we need to be breaking down these barriers, such as with this bill.
Okay, and so maybe actually, Senator Omidvar, I'm going to turn to you. Do you have any reflections on the comments that Bill and Jacqueline have been sharing with us?
Wonderful comments from the field, which I believe have underlined the impetus for the bill and for the changes. I will say that at no time does the bill propose a partnership with a non-charity unless it is in the furtherance of the charitable purpose of the charity. So there are limits around what we are proposing. A charity cannot give money to a non-charity for a non-charitable purpose. So I just want to bring the conversation back to not only the reasons why I decided with the backing of almost the entire charitable sector to embark on this adventure. I would say it has been an adventure, but also to remind us all that we are talking about charitable dollars, and there must be a high level of transparency and accountability for the charitable dollars, because they are public dollars in a way. They are protected from taxes, but they're still public dollars.
Thank you. And just to echo that, I think, part of the reason we discussed the questions on accountability and wanted to speak about furthering the charitable purpose is that, obviously there are questions from people around that issue, and the question of, is this really going to change or make it somehow easier not to further your charitable purpose or to have dollars go awry? And I think, I'm following the conversation, not really the chat, but I did notice there was a couple of questions in the chat about what's going to be different, how's it going to be different, and what are charities going to have to do if under the new rules. And I think those are good questions, and I think the answer is there's going to be a lot of steps that every registered charity will still take in order to fund activities and programs of parties that aren't qualified donees, whether domestically or internationally, that are similar to what is done today. There's going to have to be due diligence around who is the party that you're going to speak to, or you're going to work with, and partner with, or collaborate with. It's going to be, the CRA is going to require, and the rules require, that the charities spend the time to ensure that the organization that they'll be working with is reputable, is in a position to carry out the program that is of interest to both of you, and that will do so in a way that ensures that the assets or the funding is being used for charitable dollars. There will also continue to be a need to have reporting. I mean, if you're going to talk about accountability, you're going to talk about due diligence for these rules to work, you really realize that you're not going to want to just fund an organization and allow it to go off and do something that it has said it's going to do without asking for reports, without looking for the consequences and the development and what are the learnings. It will be more realistic, because if the organization that's actually drafting the work or creating the program is now the owner, instead of sort of trying to work within the current system, they can then take it forward. But it will ensure that there will be a charitable objective that is met for the purposes of these funds. It's going to ensure, and there are some who are concerned about how we can ensure that it is at the same level as it is today. And as a lawyer who provides organizations with agreements and works with organizations to implement the charitable programming they want to do, even though it might be with an international organization or an organization on the ground that is furthering the charitable purpose but hasn't registered as a charity, I can tell you the agreements are complex and end up with the use of resources towards legal fees and reporting and that sort of thing that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the funding goes to charitable purposes, but it certainly makes it a little more complicated and maybe more expensive to implement the charitable program. So I think there's lots to be said to and to think about, that this isn't just making it possible to grant to non-qualified donees without accountability, but that there is a requirement that there be some that there be provisions in place, but it allows it to be more real and more true to how organizations really want to work together. And I think that's what's so interesting about it. So Bill and Jacqueline, I'm going to turn back to you one more time, just to say, what do you think organizations could do or need to do or need to know? What else would you add before we leave this the panel discussions and go to questions? Jacqueline, I'll start with you this time.
Hey, that's a good question. And I honestly feel like I'm still processing. I've seen a few questions in the chat go by about wanting to better understand what this would actually look like in practice. So perhaps that's something we can speak to in the Q&A. But maybe just as a few kind of closing words on my end, I do just want to say that the envisioning different ways of accountability that will make our work more true for us really resonates with me. So that's a note that I would like to end on over here.
Okay. And Bill?
Yeah, I would say that it's important to recognize that many nonprofit organizations who are non-qualified donees, this may open up an opportunity where they have access to funds that they wouldn't otherwise have had access to. And that access may increase their capacity and or their ability to pursue charitable status, as this bill doesn't make a non-qualified donee equal to a qualified donee in terms of what benefits they have, how they can attract dollars, issue receipts, those types of additional benefits. And equitably, it may encourage more of the philanthropic sector to consider how it can support a broader investments across Canada, as right now many foundations and funders within the philanthropic world really avoid non-qualified donee investments because of all of the extra hurdles that they need to go through, and so try and stick with, because it's much easier when you're looking at your charitable objects and being able to accomplish that by investing in another charity versus having to extend your charitable objects to a non-qualified donee's activities. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. And so I think at this point, Sarah, we should turn to questions and answers, or questions we can provide. We'll try to provide the answers. And as I noted was in the chat, I think some questions are in the chat and some are in the Q&A. So if you have a question, Sarah's going to go through the Q&A and we'll try to answer some of those now. The first question that has been put to be asked is what do we know about the support for the bill and what's happening in the House? And I noticed, unfortunately, we knew that MP Lawrence may have to leave for question period or for other things happening in Ottawa, so he has left us. But maybe I'll ask Senator Omidvar, can you give us the update on the other parties and their support for the bill at this point in the House, to the extent you know? We won't be holding you to it, but
absolutely. I want to tell you that support for the bill is throughout the House, as it was throughout the Senate, for the very simple reason that most senators and most parliamentarians at some point have sat on the board of a charity. In the House, which is now we're at a critical juncture. The bill is being put forward by a Conservative. It was seconded by an NDP parliamentarian. I have spoken to countless Liberal parliamentarians, and I believe that support for the bill is fairly broad. We just have to see how it goes, how the debate goes. But I'm fairly confident that it will go to committee and come back from it, hopefully without any amendments, and then be passed into law by, I'm a hopeful person, I'm an optimist, maybe before we rise in June. But then, colleagues, you need to know that there is a 2-year consultation period built in. This is a private members bill. So you need to build in 2 years of robust consultations, which the CRA will lead to develop new guidelines to replace direction and control, likely with guidelines spelling out what is resource accountability, what does it entail, how will we get it, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And the next questions is a question that that maybe I'll tackle and then ask each of you if you have any other comments. It's, what are some of the risks associated for funders that they should be mindful of under the new legislation, and what kind of changes in the funding process and operations will they have to make to comply with this legislation? So I'll ask Bill and Jacqueline to think about that, but I'll give you an answer from the legal perspective. Is I think funders are going to be able to do a lot of the work they do the same way they've always done it. They're going to look for third parties, or whether they're charities or whether they're in a situation where they're working with international organizations or non-qualified donees in Canada. They're going to look for people who will further their charitable purposes and help them with the programming they want to pursue with their charity. And that the changes that might be required will more likely be around being less required to think how can we make this fit into the current rules, and more about how can we make sure that this program is successful, and how can we make sure that we can demonstrate that both as a funder and as the entity doing the work. So that there will continue to be reporting, there will continue to be required conclusions from the work that's being funded, but that it won't necessarily have to sort of be, how do we fit this into this I've called it a fiction, I guess I can continue to call it a fiction, where we're trying to find a box that's sort of listed as in the intermediary relationship that doesn't quite work in this situation. And in many situations, people are able to find ways to do it that are less complicated, but there are a lot where we do try to have to fit it into a box. So I think that's from my perspective. Bill and Jacqueline, you're both funders. So what do you think will change in your processes as a result of this legislation? Let me turn it to Bill first.
Well, as we already provide funding to non-qualified donees, it will change the discussions that we have with those entities in providing that funding to be more equitable with those that we have with the qualified donees, because we have to put significant additional layers of required accountabilities and language that speaks to that entity doing the work of the organization's charitable objects, not their own, and that being able to switch that conversation, I think, is a really important element that it will change in a good way, because then we're not talking about that entity having to do the work, fulfill the charitable objects of me as a funding organization, and instead being able to work towards their mission and what their work is intended to be focused towards. And so being able to find that alignment between those two elements, and that switch, I think, is a positive one. It will also encourage change within some of the ways that we fund and the way we design the funding programs for funding streams for entities, because we should always be considering change. And looking at ways that can best serve the needs of those whom we're providing the funds to, versus our own needs or the needs of the systems that we're serving. So being able to always have a lens of change is also important.
Okay, and Jacqueline, do you want to add some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so from my end, speaking as the co-director of a group with charitable status, so we're not funders and we don't give grants directly, but we provide capacity building supports. So as an organization with charitable status, what would change for us with this legislation is that it would make it a lot less burdensome for us to be building good partnerships with folks on the ground, with the grassroots organizers and activists that we exist to support. So that's the bottom line for us, and it would be just really nice to be able to direct our energies and time and budget to things that we know are aligned with our mission and our charitable status, our charitable objective. Sorry.
Thank you. That's great to hear. And just to sort of continue on with some of the other questions. There's a couple of questions speaking about tax receipts and nonprofits and whether this changes their status for CRA purposes. And maybe I will address that. I mean, the answer is this is not, the current rules under the Income Tax Act is you can't give to a charity, you can't do indirectly what you're not allowed to do directly. So you're not allowed to issue, you don't get a tax receipt if you give to a non-qualified donee today. And the same would be the result in the future. The CRA is that there's no change to that rule. We're not suggesting that an international organization or a non-qualified donee Canadian organization somehow now gets a special right to issue tax receipts. We're not saying nonprofits in Canada become qualified donees. It's really, I mean, in many ways, we are just reinforcing the current system. I mean, the money donations have to be given to the charity for their charitable programs. A charity shouldn't receive funding unless it's going to be used for their own charitable programs or for their charitable programs. If the charity makes a decision based on everything, all the facts and information that are in front of it, that the way to further their purpose, the way to pursue their program is through some kind of an agreement with a third party or some kind of relationship with the third party that isn't a qualified donee, then it's up to the charity to put in place the due diligence and the requirements to ensure that the funds go to further their purpose. That really isn't changing. And there's nothing in these rules that would change those longstanding rules that relate to tax receipts or the status of nonprofit societies. So I think it's important to understand that. Some people want to know whether these non-qualified donees could become registered charities. And the reality is that an international organization cannot become a registered charity in Canada, because the definition of an organization that's entitled to be a registered charity in Canada is an organization that's established and incorporated in Canada, or is established actually is the language. So it's not an answer to say to international groups, well, you can apply for status in Canada, because they have to actually set up a separate entity here. So that's another hurdle that, of relying on, is everyone a qualified donee? And then I think, as both Jacqueline and Bill have talked about, not all organizations that may do community work, that may fit into having a program that is a benefit to the community and will further a charitable purpose, are organizations that otherwise want to be registered as a charity. They may not be organizations that require or want to be raising monies and giving tax receipts. They may simply be an organization that is doing great research and work in a particular area, perhaps in the environment, as a nonprofit that really would further a charitable purpose and support activities of a charity, but they don't see that they want to move into the charitable sector for all of the other work they do. So there's a number of reasons why adopting a system, which is very similar to systems we have in other countries, would facilitate the ability of today's charities and charitable funders working in a broader way. One of the other questions focused on how are we going to ensure about the accountability, or how is that going to be done? And the Canada Revenue Agency isn't disappearing in this discussion. The Canada Revenue Agency, in the same way that it will audit charities today and look at relationships the charity has today and assess whether the charity is properly furthering the charitable purposes, we'll continue to do that. We've actually been quite lucky in Canada. We have a self-assessment type of tax system where there is a lot of obligation put on the taxpayers, whether they be charities or individuals or corporations, to comply with the rules. And I think generally we have a pretty good record in this country of people complying with the rules. The Canada Revenue Agency works to ensure that if there are some that don't, that they're available as the regulator to do that. I don't think that we should see this as being any different than any other type of provision of the Income Tax Act that requires people to comply. I think that the funders will ensure that they're working with organizations that will do the work that is intended to further the charitable purposes. And I think the system of accountability that's in the bill will help with that.
Susan, may I just address a bit of that question?
Yeah,
because it's
for
a
sure.
really important question. You know, as I said, charitable dollars are public dollars and they're tax exempt dollars, and we have to make sure that they're being used to advance charitable purpose. And Susan is absolutely right that the CRA still will continue to be a very big part of audits and monitoring and oversight. But the bill itself goes into some detail in terms of how resource accountability will provide the level of comfort to tax-paying Canadians and the Canadian public, because it outlines in the Act itself what reasonable steps charities can be expected to take before entering into an arrangement with a non-charity. It outlines, and here it is, Section A, before providing resources to a person who is not a qualified donee, the charity must collect the information necessary to satisfy a reasonable person that the resources will be used for a charitable purpose by the person who is not a qualified donee, including information on the identity, experiences, and activities of the person. And B, when providing resources to a person who is not a qualified donee, it establishes, measures, imposes restrictions or conditions, or otherwise takes actions necessary to satisfy a reasonable person that the resources are being used exclusively for a charitable purpose by the person who is not a qualified donee. Now, I apologize for the legal language in there, but that's what legislation is about. But what the bill technically does, it shifts the focus of the charity from ongoing operational control to upfront due diligence, and provides a framework that will facilitate the charitable purpose of the charity by working with a non-charity under certain circumstances, but it removes operational control from the table. Once the agreement is signed, the non-charity is responsible for the operations. So I thought very long and hard about how do you actually do both things, provide greater freedom and empowerment and partnership, but also provide the same high level of accountability. And I believe that with the advice, and I've been very, very fortunate, I've benefited from the legal advice of Canada's top charity lawyers, we've arrived at this definition in the bill. So I'm confident that accountability will be provided for. It will be provided for differently, and the CRA will always be there as the second step for oversight.
Thank you. I think, Senator, you've highlighted that very well, and I think that's really speaks to a number of the questions that have been asked. There was a question about who is going to determine, or how are we going to determine what does it mean by reasonable person or reasonable steps? And I think, as in many of, and I will ask the Senator to comment on this as well, but I think as in many provision in the Income Tax Act, when we have scenarios where they ask for this type of test or this type of guidance, that we rely on CRA to help us understand what they will look for to ensure that the test is met. I mean, there's lots of legal cases that in many different areas, not only tax, that talk about, how do you determine what is a reasonable person or what is the reasonable answer? But I think that CRA can be expected in the 2-year period that's been highlighted to be providing a guidance as to what they will expect, what they think. And I think we can imagine that reasonable person is going to be someone that they're going to be identifying, or the test they set that a reasonable person would ask for will be something that will be very consistent with what the senator just talked about and what we're all concerned about. Senator, would you like to add anything to that? I think that's a question.
I think you've said it all. The only thing I would add is for those people, for those individuals who are looking for more rigor on the accountability at this point, I would remind them that the act, that the amendment is written in a way to conform with income tax legislation of charities, because typically in legislation, we lay out the broad parameters and the framework, and it is the guidance that actually provides the guts and glory. And we weren't going to put the guts and glory into the bill because that would be counterintuitive, I think, to the way legislation is written. So we've said in the bill, resource accountability must be provided. We've said in the bill, reasonable, and I know that reasonableness is defined in law. I'm not going to pretend to parse that out because I'm not an income tax lawyer. I wish I was. Maybe I've become half one through the process of this bill. But there's enough in the bill to allow the CRA to go out and do those consultations, just as they continue to do the consultations on direction and control. They'll shift direction and focus on resource accountability and what that means and what the steps could be.
I think that's right. And I think this is not, as I think we've said it before, this proposed legislative amendment is intended to improve an area where there has been long time struggles because of the way the law was written and the way not the law was written, but the way the guidance and requirements that have sort of developed around the way the law was written and referenced own activities, and which has been a huge hurdle for many organizations. And this is intended to improve it. And I think that it's taking us to a level of accountability that will ensure funds are used for charitable purposes. There was a couple of questions about how is this helping not-for-profits? And I think other than as a not-for-profit that is furthering a charitable purpose with a particular programming and able to access funding as in partnering or working with a charity, it's not changing the status of the rules of general nonprofits that aren't charities in the country. And it's not intended, there was a question about donor advised funds. Does this allow donor advised funds to give to nonprofits that aren't charities? No, that's not at all what this organization, this legislation was intended to do. It really is intended to focus on an area that has been subject to many policy discussions, many submissions to the Department of Finance, many questions of policy individuals at finance as to how can we move away from the direction and control? How can we allow charities to work around the world and in Canada with organizations on programs that further their charitable purposes without tripping over the direction and control requirements that seem to have been come out of the case law and built into the guidance over the years? And it's sort of directed in that direction and is intended to work at that. I'm going to ask Sarah, are there any questions that you think I should turn to that we haven't dealt with before we sort of turn to final remarks? I know there may be questions I haven't seen, but
No problem. There's a lot of questions that are coming through, and I know we're not gonna be able to get to them all, but let me just find one here. So I guess one of the questions that's come up, we have addressed this a little bit, but there's some criticism. This is one of the questions that came in. There's some criticism that removing the regulatory barriers doesn't actually mean necessarily that funding will start flowing to organizations that are led by or are serving racialized populations or other marginalized communities. So maybe can some of the panelists or anyone there address that question?
thank you. I saw that and I knew I was missing one that I had wanted to bring out. So maybe Jacqueline or Bill or Senator, would you like to comment? I have a certain thought, but.
Maybe.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Senator.
No, I'll go after you, Bill.
I would say that I know from the discussions that I have with many of my peers with various foundations and funders that there is the potential where more investment will go into those spaces because right now there is interest by some of those entities to provide funds, but because of the restrictions, they don't. And so there is the potential for increase, but whether that's writ large, massive increase, I can't speak to that. But I do know that there is greater interest, but they've felt like they've been restricted on their ability to invest into those spaces.
Senator?
So I worked in a previous life for a private foundation and dealt with and had to work with the work around the legal fiction. And I know that it is completely possible to engage in these workarounds, but I will tell you, we were audited a little too much for the comfort of the private foundation that I was at. So I do believe that there will be sort of an easing off, but it must be accompanied by education. And I believe that institutions like PFC, like Imagine Canada, like Cooperation Canada, must engage in education and capacity building of the sector to understand what this new law is. I will also point out that it is, I expect, and I don't, I'm not a member of the government. I don't know what they're planning to do, but a budget is going to be tabled soon. And I'm pretty confident that the government will include an increase in the disbursement quota for private foundations and raise it from the current 3.5% to something else. And part of their rationale will be to get more philanthropic money to organizations such as Indigenous and BIPOC organizations. And the truth is that A does not equal B. Raising the disbursement quota will only result in more money going into existing charities and existing charitable institutions. It will not go to those organizations which do not have an equitable share of philanthropic dollars. This bill will get us there far more rapidly than an increase in the disbursement quota.
Thank you. Jacqueline, did you want to add to that?
I would first just echo everything that both Bill and the Senator have shared already. I think it's a yes and kind of situation where this bill will move us forward, and it's not the only solution. There never is only one solution, but this accompanied with funder education, accompanied with deeper understandings of anti-oppression and redistributing wealth and what to do with these, as Senator Omidvar says, public dollars. It's all part of the picture. And the one idea that I would add to this conversation is that the relationship works both ways. So both from funders to grantees and from grantees to funders, that there needs to be trust both ways. And for especially amongst marginalized communities, receiving money, tends to come with an agenda. And yes, we're talking about accountability and furthering charitable objectives, and that's that's all good and well. But there definitely is, reservations that that grantees have about receiving money and what comes with that. So if this is a step in the direction of creating the conditions to build better trust and better relationships, I think this, as well as everything else in the picture over time, will lead to better and more justice-oriented redistribution.
Thank you. And we are coming towards the end of the seminar. So before we end, I did want to, and that might have been a nice note, but I want to ask one more question of our panelists and the senator, which is really, what do you think the most important takeaway from today is that about the bill and about the potential to move this forward after our discussion? Is there something you would like to, a message you would like to leave with our audience? Jacqueline, I'll ask you to start this time because you just stopped.
Again, still processing.
Same thing? Okay. Yeah.
Do you mind actually if I pass it to someone else first?
Not at all.
Thanks.
Senator?
For me, hearing from Jacqueline and Bill, it's sort of underlined for me yet again that it is imperative to close the distance in the philanthropic space between charity and philanthropy and communities on the margin, whether they are in Canada or outside. And in terms of opportunity, I'm beginning to be very hopeful that we will get there, but we will not get there without conversations like these filtering into campaigns that Imagine Canada is launching, that PFC and Cooperation are launching. MPs need to hear from constituents. So, if I supported this bill, and I wouldn't be a senator, but an ordinary constituent, I'd be calling my MP. I'd be calling my MP and saying, why you must support this. And that's the kind of direct political action along with petitions. MP Lawrence is going to be launching a petition. So the more people who sign on to this, the more people who speak to MPs, the more people who make more noise about this. That's what's going to make it work.
Thank you. Bill?
Well, I think I would say that there are many non-qualified donees who are doing amazing charitable-based work that's part of the lifeblood and the livelihoods of communities. And this, without removing accountability, without removing some of those things that we need to ensure in place, it is removing barriers to being able to adequately support and build relationship between the philanthropic world and the amazing charitable-based work that is being done in our communities. So I'll leave this at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacqueline?
Yeah, I think perhaps a closing thought from me would be around the necessity of reimagining, with regards to this, and reimagining how we can do things better in terms of accountability, so that we can do our work in good ways and in truer ways. And I mean, we're living in a very fraught time, and I think the skill, the exercise, the muscles of reimagination are muscles that we ought to exercise, and this is one of the ways we can do that.
That's nice.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I wanted to say, just before I turn it over to Bernadette, who's going to do the close, that the one thing that I'm encouraged about, and Senator Omidvar, don't shoot me, I actually am really happy to see the questions and the discussion around how are we going to make sure this is okay, this is going to work, that we aren't going to end up in a situation where somehow charitable dollars are misused or are taken outside of the sector. Because I I really don't believe that this is opening that door wider than it's open today. And but I do think those are important questions and they're important discussions to have. And I think the point about continuing to have the discussions in the sector and continuing to sponsor these kinds of discussions is really important, because it truly will. There will be accountability. There will be it will change and make the system more transparent, more real. But it's intended to just facilitate and maybe I'll steal Jacqueline's word, reimagine how we're doing things in a way that will allow organizations to further their purposes better. So thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you for the opportunity, Imagine and PFC, for allowing me to moderate. And with that, I will turn it over to Bernadette from Imagine Canada.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, thank you, Susan, for the very skilled moderation and legal perspective. Thanks for all of you for attending today. This was a really impressive attendance for something that used to be a pretty not very well known policy file. The pandemic has really changed that, as well as Senator Ratna Ahmedvar's leadership, and we thank her. And particularly thank you, Bill and Jacqueline, for the work that you do and for spending this hour and a half with us. So as the Senator had mentioned, it would help greatly for individuals to connect with their MPs. And to support that, we have put together a briefing note in French and English for you to use in those engagements with parliamentarians. If you require any other kind of support in supporting this bill, please get in touch with us at publicpolicy@imaginecanada.ca. And please sign up for our early alert. It's a free weekly newsletter where we will continue to update you on the bills passing through the House and other policy and research news related to the charitable sector. And that's all for today, I believe. Oh, there's also a lobby day in the works to support the bill. You can hear more about that through the early alert, or please also get in touch at publicpolicy@imaginecanada.ca to learn more. It'll be in early May. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.